Welcome to Evaluating Codes of Conduct, presented by Ben Wentworth, PhD. This is part of the Student Development Associates Incorporated Special Learning Series. Our agenda today is to discuss the intended learning outcomes of this presentation, discuss the who, what, when, where, and why of evaluation. We'll then spend a good bit of time discussing the how of evaluation. This will include a look at the four phases of evaluation, reading like an evaluator to help you have successful times with your fellow evaluators, and then we'll dive into some tips for success to close out the day. So, first things first, intended learning outcomes are threefold here. We want you to be able to build an evaluation plan, conduct an evaluation, and craft useful feedback for your fellow evaluators, and that is what we hope you'll be able to do at the end of this program. So, first, what is evaluation? Evaluation is generally defined as judging the quality or worth of a thing. When discussing and considering codes of conduct, we have to ask ourselves, is it needed? Is it worth the cost that it takes to implement? Is the code of good quality? And is the code having the intended result? Of these questions, the last two are of primary concern for this session. If you want to take a minute and pause and think about how you can get data to answer the above questions, I invite you to do so. In the time being, I will say that student codes of conduct are needed. People need guidelines in order to make sure that they meet the high standards of the institutions they're attending, and the institution needs to have the ability to objectively measure people's interactions and actions against a defined standard of behavior. Is it worth the cost? Generally, yes. In terms of liability and the ability to protect the institution, it's hard to overstate the need for a code of conduct. Is it of good quality? Is something that varies by institution, and we will help you evaluate today. And lastly, is the code of conduct having the intended result? Is it meeting the goals that we expect? Is it helping us succeed in furthering the mission of the institution and the Office of Student Conduct? Again, that's something you and your fellow evaluators will have to dig into. So, why engage in evaluation? Three main reasons. One, conduct issues evolve over time. The issues of the late 1900s are far different from those of the early 2000s, which are far different from the mid 2000s that we're about to enter. Second, evaluation is an intentional way that we can prune the code of conduct and help make sure that it stays lean and doesn't get bloated with small changes piling up over time as different people put their thumb on it. And finally, evaluation helps us unify policy and practice. If over the course of years we realize that our practices have changed from the code of conduct, we're faced with a dilemma. Do we follow exactly what's written in the code, even though practice no longer supports it and we may not remember how to do that practice? Or do we update the policy in order to make sure that it remains tied closely to what we are actually doing? As a discussion point, I invite you to pause and consider what new conduct topics or concerns have arisen for you and your team over the last 2 or 3 years, and do your codes address them? In particular, as I record this in early 2023, I'll point out that we are in the midst of an artificial intelligence writing crisis almost here in higher education. 2 or 3 years ago, the idea of an AI created paper or text was simply unimaginable. Now, though, we're receiving almost daily reports about students submitting work that was created using artificial intelligence. So, when do we evaluate? This will vary a lot on the load and the staffing of your office. If you're an office of one, then it's very likely that it will take you more time and you'll have more space between evaluation cycles. Meanwhile, if you have a large office and a large staff, it might very well be that you have someone who's tasked with following up regularly on evaluation topics and making sure that the code stays up to date. That said, every other year is typically sufficient to ensure that the code of conduct is staying updated and streamlined. That said, There's no problem with having a living document so that you can track your thoughts and issues between the cycles of evaluation. This living document could be some sort of Google document, some sort of cloud based document, or some other form of storage that lets people track where students, staff, and faculty have misinterpreted parts of the code or have had questions that arise multiple times over the course of practicing and working with the code. Your reflection question for this slide: when was the last time your code of conduct was evaluated? Why was it then? And if you have not evaluated in over 2 years, why not? Or, maybe more importantly, why evaluate it now? Who should participate in codes of conduct evaluation? Here, we've ranked a number of areas that are useful and that we think should be given, and this is the order that we would suggest recruiting in. Number one, all conduct office staff need to be part of the evaluation. If there's someone who is working in the office and is not providing insight, then there is a serious issue of trust going on here, and I would highly consider you to reconsider leaving that person out. These are the people who know the code in and out and are the closest to it and will have the most impact from it changing. Second, I would suggest recruiting your hearing board members, whether this is some sort of student integrity board, university judiciary, or some other group. The people who actually exercise the code, not in their day in and day out lives, but more often than the typical student or staff member, are excellent resources to get insightful but still knowledgeable views. Third is campus stakeholders. These should range from campus uh, police, campus security, housing and residence life staff, maybe even career services or other groups that you work with closely. Tutoring services would even be useful if you're working with academic dishonesty policies, for instance. Having these stakeholders come in so that you can make sure that the language you use is understandable by other people who don't work with it every day is crucial. And finally, external voices, such as graduate interns, practicum students, or other people who are not familiar with the code of conduct. While very useful, we've placed them at number 4 here simply because they're most likely to have a transient interaction with the code, and while able to provide a wonderful, fresh insight, they are also going to be the hardest to recruit. So, go ahead and take a moment to pause and discuss amongst yourselves who are your campus stakeholders and the external voices that you might want to consider. How do you see them adding to the evaluation, if at all? Now, where is the evaluation conducted? In two broad strokes, we have the in person and the virtual options. In person, we can further divide into within the conduct office, such as in a meeting space or conference room, an on campus meeting space, or even an off campus meeting space, such as a coffee shop, a local wilderness retreat, or some other area that the group is able to come together for a few hours and discuss the code readily. Virtually, we're able to discuss things like having a video call where people share their screen and work through the code together, a cloud based document that has people editing it live, or even engaging in asynchronous comments where people are able to dedicate time over a set span and simply turn in their comments on a shared document over the course of a few weeks or even a couple of months. So as you consider these options, what's is virtual or in person better and more appropriate for your group? Is some combination of the two better? For instance, could you have asynchronous comments in in a cloud based document at the start and then have an in person meeting later on when you're finalizing the recommendations for changes? And would multiple meetings or spaces be better? There's no reason to have an evaluation happen all in one go. So perhaps there's a time where you meet in the conduct office to divvy up tasks and then meet in an off campus space in order to make sure that there are minimal distractions and no people dropping by just to visit when you're going through the really in depth reads. Now we're going to dig into the how. of an evaluation, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time today. In terms of how to conduct an evaluation, we at Student Development Associates have come up with a four-phase approach that we like to suggest. The first phase is planning the evaluation. The second step is implementation, then completion and reporting, and finally publication. Each of these will take a different amount of time, but we'll go ahead and say the more time you put into the planning phase, the easier the implementation and other phases will be. So, phase one, planning. Again, this is where you'll want to spend a great deal of time to make sure that the upcoming stages are readily accessible and easily completed. In this phase, we want you to designate an evaluation leader, a person who's in charge not of deciding what changes are made, but in charge of making sure that the evaluation process is clear, straightforward, and that people have the tools and resources they need in order to do the evaluation. The evaluation leader will lead the development of the evaluation plan. They will recruit evaluators. This is a time where you may have someone working alongside them to serve as sort of a liaison or helping make contacts with evaluators and potential evaluators. The evaluation leader will also build a timeline so that they can have a measure of when things will be done and when certain deliverables will be delivered. And finally, the evaluation leader will construct, update, or delegate the construction and updating of any work aids. For instance, this could be diagrams, flowcharts, or other tools to help the evaluators more easily digest and work through the code of conduct. For those of you who might be an evaluation leader or designating one, how much lead time do you need them to develop a plan? Is 1 month sufficient? Are they familiar enough that they would complete it in that short time? Or is this something that's new and they might need a semester to prepare in order to have the actual evaluation occur over a summer term, for instance? And when are the best or worst times for your evaluators? As we all know, every office on campus has its own sort of pulse and its busy times and its lull times. How are you able to plan the evaluation to account for the lulls and waves of the different offices you're working with? And especially, how can you make sure that the evaluation does not take place during the peak of the season for the conduct office? Phase two is implementation. So at this point, the evaluation leader and their team has been assembled, and they're now going to train the evaluators. They're going to teach them how to read like an evaluator, what's expected in the process, and give them the tools they need to actually succeed by providing them with the various work aids. In the implementation phase as well, this is where the actual review of the code of conduct occurs. This is the part where people will sit down with the code of conduct, read it as an evaluator, and provide feedback, comments, insights, thoughts, questions, concerns, whatever else to the code of conduct. At this point, the evaluation leader or their designee will consolidate the evaluator comments and feedback, whether it's from the work aids or through cloud based storage, whatever means they've chosen. Then there should be a review of the feedback for common themes and trends. Are the different evaluators seeing issues? Where are they seeing things that could be made more clear? Are there other topics that arise? The evaluation layer should then consolidate the proposed edits into a single document and review the edits for contradictory language, required language from, say, a system office, or inconsistent language. Doing so means that the evaluation leader has been able to thoroughly parse through and digest the code of conduct and ideally implemented multiple pieces of feedback with multiple brains thinking over the same topic. Phase three is completion and reporting. At this point, the evaluation leader and whoever is actually in charge of the code of conduct, for instance, a dean of students or a director of the Office of Student Conduct, will finalize the proposed edits and guide the edits through the policy revision process. This is the part that can take a great deal of time if the changes suggested are substantive. However, if they are small changes, if they are minor things, or if the changes are ones that promote clarity and conciseness, it might be easier to move them through quickly. However, as you are thinking through this process and making that plan, consider how long does it take for the policy revision process to occur? Is it something that you would need to send up through the cabinet? Is it something where the cabinet only meets once a semester? How often are you able to actually review and get these revisions completed? This should influence your timeline, especially if you're looking to change the code of conduct over the summer and need it to be completed before students return for the fall semester. You want to make sure that the cabinet or whoever is in charge of policy revisions has enough time with your suggested revisions to make them into the final product. After that, once the edits and revisions are completed and approved, you will publish them. You can have a revised code of conduct available. You might want to capture notes for future evaluations. Having a living document that lets you say, we wanted to change this, but we didn't because of A, B, or C is useful. And finally, congratulate yourselves on a job well done. Send out some thank you emails, have a lunch, have something to celebrate the fact that you've completed a successful evaluation. And so, your review question or thought: what incentives can you provide to complete the evaluation to your evaluators, to the team, or even to yourselves? So, in the last few slides, we referred to reading as an evaluator and simply said it as if it happens. We want to take a moment, though, and recognize that reading like an evaluator is not like reading a book, and it's also not like reading a term paper. There's no grade to be assigned, there's no rubric for what makes a good or bad code of conduct. However, there are a few guidelines that are useful for thinking about how to make them better. Number one, try to read like a student. Consider what the average 18 to 25-year-old knows and what your typical student at your institution looks like and is expected to read in terms of level and knowledge and skill. You want to make sure that you are adjusting your language to meet your students at the lowest common denominator so that no one will be confused. With that in mind, try to misinterpret or be confused about language. Look for ways to intentionally find loopholes or inconsistencies or things where if you just barely tweak what a word means or how the sentence is read, you're able to misinterpret and get something different out. Because trust me, students will notice these things and they will seek them out. Again, look for these loopholes, look for inconsistencies, recognize that there is power in the phrase, uh, in phrases such as includes but is not limited to, and etc. Those are powerful words. Look for potentially confusing language. A lot of times, the code of conduct will refer to things such as the burden of evidence or uh, the amount of evidence that is needed. Make sure that you define what that is using the technical term, such as preponderance of the evidence, but that you also give it in lay people terms. For instance, preponderance of the evidence, also known as more likely than not. That way, people who have run into the confusing language are able to use their context clues in order to make sense of it. You don't lose any points and it doesn't cost any more money to make it simpler to read. The next to last item here is one of the hardest to do, and it is to read without your assumptions or your knowledge. Keep in mind that, especially for those of you who are leading this evaluation project, you are intimately familiar with the code of conduct. You work with it for multiple hours every day, and you have to describe it and discuss it with students multiple times a week, probably. You need to set aside the assumptions of what things are actually saying, and you need to set aside your knowledge of other parts of the code of conduct. If you know that a term is defined in paragraph one of page one, but you don't actually use it until page 17, then you need to question whether or not that small reference or definition on page one is really useful or if it should be moved here to the one or two spots where you are actually using the term. In short, try to make the code of conduct an object, an artifact that can be read starting at any point without needing you to jump back and forth to get the full picture. And finally, read the document aloud, slowly, and documenting your thoughts as you go. This might even take the form of starting a voice recording and recording yourself reading it and putting in some sort of signal to yourself, such as a clap or a snap, in order to see in your recorded file the spots where you have thoughts. Doing so lets you go through later and easily and readily track what you were thinking in the moment. And finally, some tips for success. Number one, capture some common misinterpretations and misconceptions in a living document. Simply having a Doodle file or some other document where conduct officers are able to throw in that they had a student misinterpret a certain thing, or that there's a part of a code that is no longer relevant or that is phrased poorly, lets you evaluate those instead of having to keep track of them in the back of your head somewhere. Next, break reading and evaluation sessions into digestible portions. Don't think that this is a marathon that you have to complete all in one day, starting at 8, ending at 5. Set things out a few weeks ahead, even a couple of months ahead. Let people read at their own pace. Maybe focus on just a page or two or just a section or two at a time. Don't let perfect become the enemy of better either. The goal is not to have a perfect code of conduct. That doesn't exist and it can never exist because there's always an exception and always an issue. Instead, simply try to make it better than the one that you have now and make it more clear and more readable for students. And keep that in mind. Your audience is college students. You're not trying to impress your friends who are serving at other institutions. You're not trying to out any sort of huge, impressive patterns. You want to get college students at your institution to understand the code of conduct. With that in mind, there might be required language that you need to integrate. Make sure it's in there early. Get that in there so that you're working around it instead of trying to jam required language from, say, a board of regents or a board of directors later on in the game when it's a lot harder to figure out where to put it. And finally, track changes is very much your friend. The ability to suggest edits and the ability to comment in edits and ideas is crucially important if you want to make sure that you're able to see where and how ideas evolved. In conclusion, though, this is your process. Evaluation is a process for you, and it is your conduct process as well. Own it, own your code of conduct, and make it work for you. Don't let the code of conduct dictate exactly what you must do. If there's a part of it that is not working, find ways to adjust it and evaluate it until you are in agreement with what is working for your students to serve them better. If you want some further reading and resources, I highly suggest Shu et al.'s Assessment and Student Affairs Second Edition. It was released in 2016, so hopefully we'll see a third edition in the nearish future. Um, but they have great resources for actually running an evaluation or an assessment and getting into the nitty gritty if you want to delve further than this short presentation can. That said, if you want to have this presentation expanded on, or you want to have us come speak with your institution, you can contact us at info@studentdevassociates.com, where we help you help students.